Purchasing power stress. Why CPI no longer reflects the real cost of maintaining civilization. Summary statement. CPI measures consumer basket inflation. PPSI measures the rising stress cost of maintaining civilization itself. Since 2020, the gap between the two may reveal that upstream systems, energy, food, fertilizer, infrastructure, logistics, and monetary confidence have repriced far more aggressively than headline inflation metrics suggest. The result is a growing disconnect between official inflation narratives and the real-world purchasing power pressures experienced across modern civilization. Section 1, Introduction. The Inflation Disconnect. Something feels wrong. That is the recurring phrase echoed across households, businesses, investors, and even governments since 2020. Official inflation numbers may say 3%, 5%, or 8%. Yet people across the developed world increasingly describe a reality that feels materially worse. Energy bills exploding, food becoming unaffordable, insurance costs surging, housing becoming inaccessible, and infrastructure itself becoming more expensive to maintain. This disconnect has produced growing distrust in official inflation narratives. Not necessarily because CPI is fake, but because CPI was never designed to measure the full stress burden of maintaining modern civilization. CPI, the Consumer Price Index, measures the changing cost of a consumer basket. But civilization is not merely a shopping basket. Civilization is energy systems, logistics systems, food systems, industrial systems, reserve systems, and infrastructure systems, all interacting simultaneously. And when the foundational inputs required to maintain those systems begin repricing aggressively, stress accumulates throughout the economy long before it fully appears in downstream consumer baskets. That distinction matters enormously. Because inflation may not simply be prices going up, it may increasingly represent the rising stress cost of maintaining access to civilization itself. That realization leads us toward a different framework. The Purchasing Power Stress Index, PPSI, a layered framework designed not merely to track consumer inflation, but to measure the stress and purchasing power burden emerging across civilization's core operating systems. Section 2, the problem with CPI. To understand why the PPSI framework exists, we first need to understand what CPI actually measures, and just as importantly, what it does not. The Consumer Price Index was designed primarily to track changes in household consumption, consumer transactions, and cost of living baskets. Its purpose is administrative and policy-oriented, central bank targeting, wage negotiations, pension adjustments, and inflation expectations management. But CPI contains several structural features that intentionally smooth volatility. These include substitution effects, hedonic adjustments, and owner's equivalent rent calculations. Substitution effects assume consumers switch to cheaper alternatives when prices rise. Hedonic adjustments attempt to estimate quality improvements in products over time. Owner's equivalent rent estimates what homeowners would theoretically pay themselves in rent rather than tracking real-time housing market stress directly. The result is an index designed to stabilize and smooth consumer inflation measurements over time. But upstream civilization maintenance pressures behave very differently. Energy does not care about hedonic adjustments. Fertilizer does not care about substitution effects. Shipping bottlenecks do not disappear because a statistical basket was optimized, and electricity grids cannot be maintained through narrative smoothing. This becomes especially important during periods of systemic stress. After 2020, the world experienced massive monetary expansion, fractured supply chains, commodity scarcity, logistics bottlenecks, geopolitical fragmentation, and reserve access stress. The repricing occurred first in oil, diesel, natural gas, fertilizer, freight, industrial materials, and reserve assets. Only later did portions of those pressures bleed into downstream consumer baskets. This is why many people increasingly felt official inflation statistics were failing to capture reality. Not because CPI was necessarily dishonest, but because CPI was measuring something different. Section 3, Commodity inflation as the fingerprint of monetary stress. Commodity inflation may be one of the clearest fingerprints of monetary debasement interacting with physical reality. This insight became increasingly difficult to ignore after 2020. when trillions of dollars of monetary expansion collided with constrained energy systems, fractured logistics, supply chain bottlenecks, and finite industrial throughput, the result was not merely higher prices. The result was civilization maintenance stress. Oil surged, natural gas surged, fertilizer prices exploded, freight rates multiplied, electricity costs spiked globally, industrial metals repriced aggressively, food insecurity spread across multiple regions simultaneously. These were not isolated incidents. They were upstream stress signals emerging throughout the core systems required to maintain modern civilization. And importantly, these pressures appeared long before CPI fully reflected them. Because civilization operates upstream before stress manifests downstream, a shortage of fertilizer today becomes a food problem tomorrow. A shortage of diesel today becomes a logistics problem tomorrow. An electricity shortage today becomes an industrial slowdown tomorrow. This is why focusing exclusively on downstream consumer baskets can produce a misleading picture of real systemic pressure. The world was not merely experiencing inflation, it was experiencing a repricing of civilization-critical throughput systems. This content is brought to you by Bobby Giggs. Promote your brand here and reach a wide audience across platforms like YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. Follow the links in the description to get started. Section 4. The birth of the PPSI framework. The original question was deceptively simple. If we were to construct a commodity index that truly reflected monetary debasement and inflation, would existing indices like CRB or GSCI be sufficient? The answer increasingly appeared to be no. Traditional commodity indices were primarily designed for tradability, futures exposure, portfolio construction, and commodity beta, not civilization maintenance diagnostics. That distinction changed everything, because once the objective shifted from tracking commodity performance to tracking civilization maintenance stress, the architecture itself had to change. The guiding question became, if this becomes structurally expensive, does civilization become materially harder to maintain? That question became the North Star of the framework. Under this logic, diesel matters more than luxury commodities, fertilizer matters more than speculative metals, copper matters more than thinly traded financial contracts, because these are civilization maintenance inputs. This ultimately led to the development of the Purchasing Power Stress Index, PPSI, a layered framework designed to measure the rising stress burden required to maintain modern civilization across energy, food, agricultural throughput, infrastructure, logistics, and monetary confidence systems. Unlike CPI, which measures consumer transaction baskets, PPSI attempts to measure the rising strain of maintaining civilization itself. Section 5. The 6 PPSI layers. The PPSI framework organizes civilization maintenance stress into 6 interdependent layers. Number 1, energy layer. This is the foundational layer. Modern civilization is fundamentally an energy conversion system. This layer includes crude oil, diesel, natural gas, electricity, and related power throughput systems. Without affordable energy, transportation weakens, food systems weaken, industrial systems weaken, and logistics systems weaken. Energy is upstream of civilization itself. Number 2, food layer. This layer measures immediate survival pressure. It includes wheat, rice, corn, soybeans, and other calorie and protein backbones. Food inflation is not merely a consumer issue, it is a civilizational stability issue. Number 3, fertilizer and agricultural throughput layer. This layer measures future food production capacity. It includes urea, potash, phosphate, and sulfur. Fertilizer systems are civilization multipliers. Without fertilizer throughput, agricultural yields collapse, food affordability deteriorates, and geopolitical instability rises rapidly. Number 4, industrial and infrastructure layer. This layer measures civilization building capacity. It includes copper, steel, aluminum, cement, nickel, and lithium. These materials represent electrification, transportation, construction, and industrial scaling capacity. 5, logistics and coordination layer. Civilization depends on movement. This layer tracks shipping, freight, rail, trucking, and global coordination costs. A civilization unable to move goods efficiently experiences rising systemic friction everywhere simultaneously. Number 6, monetary escape and reserve access layer. This layer measures monetary confidence stress. It includes gold, silver, Bitcoin, and reserve access pressures, because countries that lose reserve access eventually struggle to purchase fuel, food, fertilizer, and critical imports. This layer therefore measures purchasing power defense systems. Section 6, CPI versus PPSI. Since 2020, the PPSI framework becomes most visible when contrasted directly against CPI. The prototype comparison since January 2020 showed the following approximate trajectory. In 2020, CPI remained relatively stable, while PPSI fluctuated around baseline levels during the COVID crash and recovery period. By 2021, PPSI had risen approximately 45 to 55%, while CPI had risen only modestly by comparison. By 2022, PPSI entered peak stress territory, reaching approximately 85 to 110% above the January 2020 baseline, while CPI remained far lower. By 2023, PPSI partially consolidated, but still remained dramatically above CPI readings. By 2024 and 2025, the divergence widened again, particularly as energy systems, logistics, industrial inputs, and monetary confidence pressures continued repricing. By 2026 year-to-date, the prototype PPSI suggested civilization maintenance stress had risen materially faster than official CPI since the January 2020 baseline. The graph summarizing this comparison showed CPI rising gradually and steadily over the period, while PPSI experienced large upward repricing waves, particularly during the energy shock, fertilizer shock, freight spike, and reserve access stress cycle of 2021 to 2022. The figures remain prototype approximations and rely on transparent assumptions regarding weighting, normalization, volatility smoothing, and component selection. But the directional divergence is the important signal. The PPSI suggests that civilization maintenance inputs repriced dramatically faster than official consumer inflation metrics after 2020, especially during the energy shock, fertilizer shock, freight spike, and reserve access stress cycle of 2021 to 2022. The implication is profound. Modern inflation may first emerge upstream in civilization maintenance systems long before it fully appears in downstream consumer baskets. Section 7. The deeper civilizational implication. The deeper implication of the PPSI framework is that modern inflation may increasingly represent rising civilization maintenance burden, not merely consumer price increases or monetary statistics. As systems age, infrastructure becomes more expensive to maintain, debt burdens compound, energy systems strain, reserve systems fragment, and logistics become more fragile. Eventually, more and more economic activity becomes dedicated simply to maintaining existing systems rather than building new productive capacity. This is where the distinction between productive growth and maintenance churn becomes critical. GDP can rise while civilization simultaneously becomes more fragile, more indebted, less affordable, and harder to sustain. This is one reason why many advanced economies increasingly feel trapped. Rising debt, aging demographics, infrastructure decay, reserve access competition, and mounting maintenance costs. The issue is no longer simply how much growth can we generate. The issue increasingly becomes how expensive is civilization itself becoming to maintain. That is the deeper signal PPSI attempts to detect. Section 8. Conclusion. Measuring the real cost of civilization. CPI remains useful, but it measures consumer transaction inflation. The PPSI framework attempts to measure something broader, civilization maintenance stress. That distinction matters because modern civilization depends on energy throughput, food security, fertilizer systems, industrial infrastructure, logistics coordination, and monetary confidence. And when those systems begin repricing aggressively, stress accumulates long before it fully appears in downstream consumer baskets. The PPSI framework therefore suggests that inflation may no longer be understood merely as prices going up. It may increasingly represent the rising strain and purchasing power burden required to maintain access to civilization itself.